Nobody at that dinner expected 7 simple words to change the way I saw my marriage. It was a Thursday evening in early September, and my husband Michael and I had invited his mother Patricia over for dinner. The weather was still warm enough to keep the windows open, and a soft breeze drifted through our dining room carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighborhood. Everything about the evening felt ordinary. I had spent most of the afternoon preparing a homemade pasta dish, Michael had opened a bottle of wine, and Patricia arrived carrying a lemon pie from a local bakery she loved. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether the most important moments in life always begin disguised as completely normal days. At the time, I certainly thought this was one of them. We had been married for just over 2 years and had recently moved into our first house together. It was not a huge home. It was a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes outside the city. But it was ours. Every room carried evidence of our shared decisions. The paint colors, the furniture, the framed photographs hanging along the hallway. We had worked hard to create a space that felt like the beginning of our future. During dinner, the conversation flowed easily. Patricia talked about a community fundraiser she had attended over the weekend. Michael shared stories from work. I mentioned a new coffee shop that had opened nearby. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, just as I was clearing plates from the table, Patricia smiled and said something that made me stop walking. "By the way, when are you two going to give me a key to the house?" For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. I even smiled. But Patricia did not laugh. She simply waited for an answer. Michael chuckled lightly and reached for his glass of water. "A key?" he asked. Patricia nodded. "Of course. Every mother should have a spare key in case of emergencies." Her tone was casual, almost cheerful. The kind of tone people use when discussing something they assume has already been agreed upon. I slowly returned to my chair. "What kind of emergency?" I asked. Patricia waved a hand. Dismissively. "Oh, you never know. What if you are traveling? What if something happens? What if you need someone to check on the house?" Michael nodded as though the explanation made perfect sense. "That is actually not a bad idea." I felt a strange tightening in my chest. It was difficult to explain. Patricia had not demanded access to our bank account. She had not insulted me. She had not raised her voice. She had simply asked for a key. Yet something about the request felt bigger than it sounded. I glanced around our dining room. The house suddenly felt different. More vulnerable somehow. Patricia continued speaking. "My friend Susan has keys to all 3 of her children's houses. It makes family life so much easier." Michael laughed. "Mom always has examples ready." Patricia smiled proudly. "Because I pay attention." Everyone else seemed comfortable. I was the only person feeling unsettled. That realization made me question myself. Was I overreacting? Was I turning a practical conversation into something emotional? The evening continued, but I found it increasingly difficult to focus. Every time Patricia mentioned future visits or helping around the house, I found myself thinking about that key. Eventually she left, carrying her empty pie dish and promising to call us later in the week. After the front door closed, Michael began loading dishes into the dishwasher. "So," he said casually, "what do you think about giving Mom a spare key?" I stared at him. "You are seriously considering it?" He looked surprised by my reaction. "Why would I not?" I opened my mouth and then stopped. The truth was that I did not yet know exactly why the idea bothered me so much. All I knew was that somewhere deep inside, a small warning bell had started ringing. And for the first time since moving into our dream house, I had the uncomfortable feeling that the conversation at dinner was not really about a key at all. After Michael asked the question, I stood in the kitchen staring at the dishwasher while it hummed softly in the background. The house felt unusually quiet. A few minutes earlier, the dining room had been filled with conversation and laughter. Now all I could think about was that spare key. Michael glanced over his shoulder. "Rachel." I realized I had not answered him. "I do not know," I said carefully. "The idea just makes me uncomfortable." He looked genuinely confused. "Why?" It was a simple question, but I struggled to explain my feelings. "Because it is our house." Michael smiled. "Exactly. And she is my mother." I crossed my arms. "That is not really an answer." He placed a plate into the dishwasher and closed the rack. I think you are reading too much into this. Maybe he was right. I wanted him to be right. The last thing I wanted was conflict over something that seemed so small. But even as I tried to dismiss my concerns, the feeling remained. The next morning, I woke up still thinking about it. While getting ready for work, I found myself replaying the dinner conversation in my head. The confidence in Patricia's voice bothered me more than the request itself. She had not asked whether we would consider giving her a key. She had asked when we planned to give her one. The difference seemed subtle, but it felt important. Later that day, I met my friend Lauren for coffee during lunch. We had known each other for nearly 10 years, and she had an annoying habit of noticing things before I did. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I mentioned the dinner. Lauren listened quietly while stirring her coffee. "And what did you say?" she asked. "Nothing really." The conversation moved on. She raised an eyebrow. "But it stayed in your head." I nodded. Lauren smiled knowingly. "Then it probably matters more than you think." Her answer lingered with me for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, Michael and I were watching television when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and laughed. "Mom." I barely looked up. "What does she want?" He opened the message. Then he smiled. "She is asking whether we decided about the key." I turned toward him immediately. "Already?" Michael shrugged. "She is probably just curious." Curious. The word sounded harmless. Yet something about the timing felt strange. Less than 24 hours had passed since the dinner. Why was she following up so quickly? Michael typed a response and put the phone away. "I told her we have not discussed it yet." I nodded but said nothing. The following weekend brought another small moment that caught my attention. Michael and I were spending Saturday morning assembling a bookshelf in the living room when Patricia called. He answered on speakerphone while tightening a screw. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "Are you two home today?" Michael glanced at me. "Yes." Patricia laughed lightly. "I thought so. I drove past earlier and saw both cars in the driveway." My hands froze. Michael did not react. He simply continued working. "You drove past?" Patricia sounded surprised by the question. "Of course. I was nearby." The conversation moved on, but I could not stop thinking about it. Maybe it was completely innocent. Maybe she really had been nearby. Yet when I added that moment to the request for a key, the picture became slightly more complicated. That evening, I sat on the back patio watching the sunset while Michael grilled dinner. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children rode bicycles down the street. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across nearby lawns. It should have been relaxing. Instead, I found myself asking a question I had not considered before. Why did Patricia want access to our house so badly? Not access during an emergency. Access in general. The more I thought about it, the less convinced I became that the key itself was the real issue. It felt like a symbol of something larger. Something I had not fully identified yet. When Michael joined me outside carrying 2 plates, he immediately noticed my expression. "You are still thinking about this, are you?" he asked. I looked at him carefully. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." I took a deep breath. "If my mother asked for a key to our house, would you be completely comfortable giving her one?" For the first time since the conversation began, Michael did not answer immediately. Michael's hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. For the first time since Patricia made her request, I saw uncertainty cross his face. He looked down at his plate before answering. "I guess it would depend on the situation." I nodded slowly. "That is not what you said when your mother asked." He opened his mouth then stopped. The conversation drifted into other topics, but I could tell he was thinking about it. So was I. Over the next several days, I tried to let the issue go. I focused on work, household projects, and the normal routines of daily life. Yet small things kept happening. None of them seemed important on their own. Together, however, they created a growing sense of discomfort that I could not ignore. The first incident happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home early because a client meeting had been canceled. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a familiar car slowly turning onto the next street. First I thought nothing of it. Then I recognized Patricia's vehicle. She did not stop. She simply continued driving. The entire moment lasted less than 10 seconds. But later that evening, She called Michael and casually mentioned that our lawn looked healthier than it had the previous month. I remember staring at him from across the living room. How would she know that? I asked after he ended the call. Michael shrugged. Maybe she noticed when she drove by. I tried to smile. People do not usually monitor lawn improvements while driving through neighborhoods. Michael laughed, but the joke did not completely erase my concern. A few days later, another strange moment occurred. Patricia called while I was grocery shopping. Michael answered. When I returned home, he mentioned that his mother had asked whether we were enjoying the new patio furniture. The problem was that we had purchased the furniture only 2 days earlier. We had not posted photographs online. We had not mentioned it to anyone. How did she know? I asked. Michael looked puzzled. I do not know. For the first time, he seemed genuinely curious rather than dismissive. Maybe she saw it when she drove past. The explanation was possible, but hearing it twice in 1 week felt different. That weekend, Michael and I attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by one of our neighbors. During a conversation with several people on the street, I happened to mention that Patricia lived about 20 minutes away. One of the neighbors smiled immediately. Oh, that is your husband's mother? I felt a strange sensation in my stomach. Yes. The neighbor nodded. She seems nice. I forced a polite smile. You have met her? A few times. The answer caught me completely off guard. We had lived in the neighborhood for less than a year. Really? The neighbor nodded. Sure. She has driven through several times. We talked when she stopped to ask questions about the area. I spent the rest of the evening trying not to overthink the conversation. Yet the pieces were becoming harder to ignore. Patricia knew details about our property. Patricia followed up repeatedly about the key. Patricia drove through the neighborhood often enough that neighbors recognized her. None of those facts proved anything. But together they painted a picture that felt increasingly uncomfortable. A week later, I finally experienced the moment that truly changed my perspective. It happened on a Saturday morning. Michael was helping a friend move furniture, and I was home alone organizing a hallway closet. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a car door close outside. A few seconds later, someone knocked on the front door. When I opened it, Patricia stood on the porch holding a container of homemade muffins. Surprise, she said cheerfully. I smiled politely and invited her inside. The visit itself was pleasant enough. We sat in the kitchen and talked for about 30 minutes. Then something happened that I could not stop thinking about afterward. While I was making coffee, Patricia glanced toward the hallway and casually said, I always forget which room you turned into the home office. The comment seemed harmless. Except for one detail. We had never shown her the home office. She had never been down that hallway. At least not while I was present. I turned toward her slowly. How did you know we have a home office? Patricia froze for the briefest moment. Then she smiled. Michael mentioned it once. Maybe he had. Maybe he had not. But as I looked at her expression, a feeling settled over me that I could not shake. The issue was no longer a spare key. The issue was that Patricia somehow seemed to know far more about our home than she should. After Patricia left that morning, I stood alone in the kitchen replaying the conversation in my head. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Maybe Michael had mentioned the home office. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Yet something about the brief pause before Patricia answered continued bothering me. It was not what she said. It was how she said it. That afternoon, I found myself looking back over the past 2 years of our marriage. At first, I expected to find nothing unusual. Instead, I started noticing a pattern I had never fully examined before. The memories appeared one after another like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. When Michael and I were house hunting, Patricia somehow knew details about properties we had toured even before we discussed them with her. At the time, I assumed Michael had simply shared updates with his mother. That seemed normal. But then I remembered specific moments. Patricia had opinions about neighborhoods she supposedly had never seen. She had concerns about layouts she had never walked through. She always seemed surprisingly informed. Then I remembered the moving process. During our first week in the house, Patricia arrived carrying a set of organizational containers for the pantry. I appreciated the gesture at the time. Looking back, I realized something odd. She had already decided where certain items should be stored before she had spent more than a few minutes inside the kitchen. It was as though she had a vision for our home that existed independently of us. Over the next few days, those memories kept returning. One evening, while organizing old photographs and documents, I found pictures from our housewarming party. As I flipped through them, another memory surfaced. Patricia had spent most of that afternoon giving guests tours of rooms that were not hers. At the time, everyone laughed and treated it like harmless enthusiasm. Now I saw it differently. She had behaved less like a visitor and more like someone with ownership. That realization stayed with me. The following weekend, Michael and I attended a family gathering at Patricia's house. Most of the afternoon was pleasant. Relatives chatted in the backyard. Children played games on the lawn. The atmosphere was relaxed. Then, during a conversation with Michael's aunt, I heard something that immediately caught my attention. "Your mother always talks about your house," she said with a smile. "She is so proud of it." I forced a polite laugh. "Our house?" His aunt nodded. "Yes. She shows everyone pictures." I looked toward Patricia across the yard. She was laughing with several cousins near the patio. "Pictures?" I asked. "Oh yes," his aunt replied. "The living room, the kitchen, the backyard. She has dozens." I smiled politely, but my stomach tightened. Patricia certainly had photos from our housewarming party. That alone was not unusual. Yet something about the comment felt connected to everything else. Later that evening, as Michael drove us home, I decided to bring up some of my concerns. "Can I ask you something?" He glanced over from the driver's seat. "Of course. Have you ever noticed how much your mother talks about our house?" Michael smiled. "She likes it. It feels like more than that." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. The challenge was that none of the individual incidents sounded dramatic when spoken aloud. They only became meaningful when viewed together. "She seems very invested in it," I finally said. Michael shrugged. "Maybe because she is happy for us." I wanted to agree. Part of me still hoped that was the answer. Yet another part of me kept remembering the requests for the key, the frequent drive-bys, the comments about rooms she had barely seen, the follow-up messages, the assumptions, the confidence. That night after we got home, I walked through each room before going to bed. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, the office. Every space reflected choices Michael and I had made together. Every space represented our life as a married couple. Standing in the quiet darkness of the hallway, I finally understood why the key requests bothered me so much. It was not about emergency access. It was not about convenience. It was about boundaries. Somewhere along the way, Patricia had begun viewing our home as an extension of her own life. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether she even realized she was doing it. The realization followed me for days. Once I saw the pattern, I could not unsee it. Every interaction seemed to reveal another small piece of the same puzzle. The problem was that none of those pieces looked dramatic on their own. There were no arguments. No havies conflicts. No soquin confrontations. Instead, there was something much harder to explain. A gradual erosion of boundaries that had happened so slowly I barely noticed it until now. The breakthrough came during another lunch with Lauren. We met at our usual cafe on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. After listening to several weeks of updates, she leaned back in her chair and asked a question that immediately changed my perspective. "Why are you focusing so much on the key?" I frowned. "Because that is what started all of this." Lauren shook her head. "No. The key is what made you notice all of this." "Ist er daher?" "What is the difference?" She smiled gently. "The key is not the problem, Rachel. It is a symbol." Her words landed with surprising force. For several seconds I said nothing. Lauren continued. "If Patricia had never asked for a key, would you still be noticing all these other things?" I thought about the drive-bys, the comments about rooms in the house, the constant updates, the assumptions, the involvement. Slowly I nodded. "Probably not." "Exactly." She stirred her coffee. "You are not upset about a piece of metal. You are upset because somebody seems to believe they should have access to parts of your life that belong to you and Michael." For the rest of the afternoon, I could not stop thinking about that conversation. By the time I returned home, I realized Lauren was right. The issue had never been about locks or doors. The issue was ownership. Not ownership of the property itself, but ownership of decisions. Ownership of privacy. Ownership of the space Michael and I were building together. That evening, another incident pushed my thinking even further. I arrived home from work and found Michael standing in the kitchen looking mildly surprised. "You will never guess who called today," he said. I already knew the answer. "Your mother." He laughed. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess." Michael opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water. "She wanted to know if we ever scheduled the deck repairs." I froze. "The deck repairs?" He nodded. "Yes." I stared at him. "How does she know we were considering deck repairs?" Michael stopped moving. For the first time he looked genuinely confused. "I do not remember telling her." Neither did I. We had discussed the issue privately after noticing a few loose boards near the back steps. It was not a major problem, but it was something we planned to address before winter. The conversation had happened only between the two of us, at least as far as I knew. "Maybe one of us mentioned it without realizing," Michael said. I nodded, but his uncertainty caught my attention. Unlike previous conversations, he did not sound completely convinced by his own explanation. A few days later, we attended another family gathering. During dinner, Patricia brought up the possibility of us replacing our guest bedroom furniture. I nearly dropped my fork. We had been discussing that exact project the previous weekend. Once again, Michael looked surprised. "How did you know we were thinking about that?" Patricia smiled casually. "A mother notices things." The answer generated polite laughter around the table. Yet I noticed something important. Michael was no longer laughing quite as easily. On the drive home, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Do you think Mom gets too involved sometimes?" The question was so unexpected that I almost laughed. For weeks I had been trying to explain exactly that. Now he was asking it himself. I turned toward him carefully. "What makes you ask?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I do not know." Then he sighed. "Maybe I am starting to see what you have been trying to tell me." Outside the windshield, streetlights stretched into the distance. Inside the car, something important shifted. For the first time since that dinner conversation weeks earlier, I no longer felt completely alone in my concerns. Michael had not reached a conclusion yet, but he had finally started asking questions. And sometimes asking the right question is the first step toward seeing a truth that has been sitting in front of you all along. The conversation stayed with me long after we arrived home that night. For the first time, Michael had acknowledged that something felt off. He had not defended his mother. He had not dismissed my concerns. He had asked a question. It may not sound like much, but after weeks of feeling as though I was the only person noticing the pattern, that question felt significant. The following Saturday morning, we sat together on the back patio drinking coffee. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was unusually quiet. I had promised myself not to bring up the subject again unless Michael did it first. To my surprise, he was the one who started the conversation. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I smiled slightly. "You can always ask me something." He stared into his coffee cup for several seconds. "When did you first start feeling uncomfortable around all of this?" The fact that he asked sincerely mattered. He was not looking for an argument. He was looking for understanding. I took a deep breath and told him everything. I told him about the dinner conversation. I told him how the request for a key felt less like a question and more like an expectation. I told him about the repeated drive-bys, the comments about the house, the way Patricia always seemed to know things she should not know. Most importantly, I explained how none of those moments bothered me individually. The problem was the pattern they created together. Michael listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. Occasionally he nodded as though connecting pieces in his own mind. When I finished speaking, he remained silent for nearly a minute. Then he surprised me. "I think I know why I never noticed it." I waited. "Because it has always been normal to me." That answer changed everything. For the first time, we were not discussing Patricia's behavior. We were discussing Michael's perspective. He leaned back in his chair and looked across the yard. Growing up, Mom was involved in everything. His voice remained calm and thoughtful. She knew where I was, who my friends were, what I was doing. We talked constantly. I nodded. There was nothing inherently wrong with that. After my father left, it was mostly just the two of us. He smiled faintly. I guess I got used to sharing everything. The more he talked, the clearer the situation became. Patricia was not necessarily acting out of malice. Michael was not intentionally disregarding boundaries. They were both operating according to patterns that had existed for decades. The problem was that marriage requires new boundaries, new priorities, new definitions of what belongs inside a relationship and what belongs outside it. Later that afternoon, another event pushed the conversation even further. Michael was reviewing paperwork in the home office while I was folding laundry upstairs. His phone rang. A few minutes later, he walked into the bedroom looking puzzled. That was Mom. I immediately recognized the expression on his face. What happened? He sat on the edge of the bed. She asked whether we had chosen a contractor for the deck repairs. I stopped folding a towel. Again. He nodded slowly. And then she asked if we had decided what color we wanted for the guest bedroom furniture. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, Michael looked at me. I never told her either of those things. The statement hung in the air between us. For weeks, every unusual detail had carried a possible explanation. Maybe someone mentioned something accidentally. Maybe she overheard a conversation. Maybe she was making educated guesses. But now Michael himself was confused. That mattered. Do you think she is just trying to be involved? I asked carefully. He thought about the question. Maybe. Then he sighed. But I am starting to realize that being involved and being informed are not always the same thing. That evening, we sat together in the living room discussing something we should have discussed long ago. Boundaries. Not rules designed to push family away. Boundaries designed to protect relationships. The conversation was uncomfortable at times. Honest at times, emotional at times, yet it felt productive. For the first time since this entire situation began, Michael was no longer trying to determine whether I was overreacting. He was trying to understand where the line should be. As the night came to an end, he looked at me and said something I had been waiting weeks to hear. I think we need to have a conversation with Mom. The words were calm, respectful, mature, but they also marked a turning point. Because once someone recognizes a boundary problem, pretending it does not exist is no longer possible. 3 days later, the situation finally reached a point where neither Michael nor I could ignore it any longer. Ironically, the moment that forced everything into the open seemed completely ordinary at first. It was a Saturday morning, and we had planned to spend the day working on projects around the house. Michael was replacing several shelves in the garage, while I was reorganizing storage bins in the laundry room. Around 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor named Karen. We were not close friends, but we occasionally chatted while walking our dogs. The message was short. Are you home today? I replied that I was. A few seconds later, another message appeared. I thought so. I just saw someone walking around your backyard. My stomach immediately tightened. Without thinking, I walked to the nearest window and looked outside. The yard was empty. A minute later, Karen sent another message. Never mind. I think it was a family member. She seemed comfortable being there. I thanked her and put my phone down, trying to convince myself that there was probably a simple explanation. Then I heard the garage door open. Michael walked into the house carrying a screwdriver and looked confused. Did you expect company? He asked. No. He frowned. Mom just called. I stared at him. Why? His expression grew even stranger. She wanted to know if the new shelves fit properly in the garage. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael slowly looked toward the backyard. The realization appeared on his face at exactly the same moment it appeared on mine. 20 minutes later, Patricia pulled into the driveway carrying several potted plants she claimed she wanted to give us. Normally, her arrival would have seemed generous. This time, however, the timing raised obvious questions. After we invited her inside, the conversation remained polite but unusually tense. Michael waited until we were seated in the living room before speaking. Mom, can I ask you something? Patricia smiled. Of course. How did you know I was working in the garage this morning? The smile disappeared from her face for a fraction of a second. I did not. Michael remained calm. You specifically asked whether the new shelves fit properly. Patricia hesitated. I just assumed you would be working on them today. The answer sounded reasonable. Yet something felt off. Michael seemed to notice it too. Did you stop by earlier? Patricia looked down briefly before answering. I drove past. There it was again. The drive-bys. The casual explanations. The assumptions. Only this time Michael was hearing them differently. Mom, he said carefully, why do you keep driving past our house? Patricia immediately looked defensive. Not angry. Defensive. I am not spying on you. I did not say you were. The room grew quiet. Patricia folded her hands together. I worry about you. Michael nodded. I understand that. Then why does everyone keep acting like I am doing something wrong? Her voice carried genuine frustration. That was the moment I finally understood something important. Patricia was not trying to be controlling in her own mind. She believed she was being caring, helpful, involved. The problem was that involvement had gradually crossed into territory that no longer belonged to her. Michael took a deep breath. Mom, this is not about whether you care. Patricia looked at him. Then what is it about? He glanced at me before answering. It is about space. The word seemed to catch her off guard. Michael continued. Rachel and I are building our own household, our own routines, our own life. Patricia listened silently. When you ask for updates about every decision or drive by to see what we are doing, it feels like you are still trying to be part of things that should belong to us. The room became very still. For the first time since this entire situation began, nobody changed the subject. Nobody laughed. Nobody minimized the conversation. Patricia sat quietly, absorbing every word. Then she looked around the room. Her eyes moved across the furniture, the photographs, and the small details that made the house ours. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. I did not realize it felt that way. And for the first time since that dinner weeks earlier, I believed she was telling the truth. Patricia's admission changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. The tension that had been building for weeks did not disappear, but something else replaced it. Honesty. For the first time, nobody was defending a position. Nobody was trying to win an argument. We were finally talking about what had actually happened. Patricia looked down at her hands for several moments before speaking again. I suppose I never stopped to think about how different things are now. Michael remained calm. Different does not mean worse. She nodded slowly. I know that. Then she smiled sadly. At least I think I know that. The vulnerability in her voice surprised me. For weeks, I had viewed Patricia through the lens of frustration. Every drive-by, every question, every assumption had felt like evidence of a boundary problem. Sitting there now, I saw something else too. A woman struggling to adjust to a new stage of life. That realization did not excuse the behavior, but it helped explain it. Patricia glanced around the living room again. When Michael was younger, I always knew what was happening in his life. She laughed softly, sometimes more than he wanted me to know. Michael smiled despite himself. That is definitely true. Patricia nodded. After his father left, it became a habit. We talked constantly. Every decision, every problem, every plan. Her eyes shifted toward me. Then he got married. The room fell quiet. And I told myself that nothing needed to change. There it was. Not anger. Not manipulation. Not control. Just a refusal to recognize that life had entered a new chapter. Patricia continued. I never meant to make you feel uncomfortable, Rachel. Her voice sounded sincere. When I asked about the house or the projects or the furniture, I honestly thought I was showing interest. I nodded. I believe you. She looked relieved. But I can see now that it felt different from your side. Michael leaned forward slightly. Mom, caring about us is not the problem. She looked at him. Then what is? Trust. Patricia frowned. Michael continued. When Rachel and I make decisions, we need space to make them ourselves. We need room to figure things out together. The words seemed to resonate with her. Without feeling monitored, I added gently. Patricia closed her eyes briefly and sighed. The drive-bys were a mistake. It was the first direct acknowledgement we had heard. I never thought of them that way. I was usually already nearby. She shook her head. But that does not matter. I can see how it looked. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Not every moment was comfortable. Some parts were emotional. Some parts required difficult honesty. Yet the overall tone remained respectful. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody attacked anyone. The goal was understanding, not blame. Eventually, the subject returned to the original issue. Patricia smiled awkwardly. I suppose the answer about the spare key is probably no. Michael and I exchanged a quick glance. Then I smiled. At least not right now. To my surprise, Patricia laughed. A genuine laugh. That seems fair. The response felt like another small breakthrough. Weeks earlier, she had spoken about the key as though receiving one were inevitable. Now she understood why the question carried so much weight. As the afternoon sunlight shifted across the room, the conversation gradually moved toward lighter topics. Family stories, upcoming holidays, work, friends. Yet something fundamental had changed beneath the surface. The unspoken tension was gone because the truth was no longer hiding underneath polite conversations. Before leaving, Patricia stood near the front door and looked around the house one last time. Then she turned toward us. You know what I finally realized? Michael smiled. What? Patricia looked directly at both of us. This house does not need another parent. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then she smiled softly. It already has 2 owners. After she left, Michael and I stood in the entryway watching her car disappear down the street. The silence between us felt different now. Peaceful rather than uncertain. Finally, Michael slipped his arm around my shoulders. Thank you for speaking up. I looked at him. Thank you for listening. He smiled. I should have listened sooner. Maybe that was true. But standing there in our home, I realized something important. The most meaningful changes in relationships rarely happen because someone wins an argument. They happen because people become willing to see what they could not see before. And for the first time since that dinner conversation started everything, it felt like all 3 of us were finally seeing clearly. The months that followed proved something I had not fully understood before. Healthy boundaries do not push families apart. They create the conditions that allow relationships to thrive. At first, I worried that our conversation would leave lasting tension between us and Patricia. Instead, something unexpected happened. The pressure disappeared. Without the constant uncertainty surrounding expectations and access, every interaction felt easier. Patricia still called regularly. She still visited. She still cared deeply about our lives. The difference was that she no longer felt responsible for managing them. The first sign of real change came a few weeks later. Michael and I decided to replace the guest bedroom furniture we had discussed for months. Previously, a project like that would have generated a long series of questions, suggestions, and updates. This time, we completed the entire project before mentioning it to anyone. When Patricia eventually saw the room during a planned visit, she smiled warmly. It looks wonderful. Then she moved on to another subject. The simplicity of that moment meant more than I expected. It was not about furniture. It was about trust. As autumn turned into winter, other changes followed. Patricia stopped driving through the neighborhood. At least she stopped telling us about it. More importantly, she no longer seemed interested in monitoring every detail of our household decisions. Instead of asking for updates on every project, she asked how we were doing. Instead of focusing on the house, she focused on the people living inside it. Around Thanksgiving, I experienced a moment that perfectly captured how much things had changed. Our family gathered at Patricia's house for dinner. During the meal, one of Michael's cousins mentioned moving into a new apartment. The conversation quickly shifted toward spare keys and emergency contacts. Several relatives shared stories about family members who kept extra keys to their homes. Then someone jokingly asked Patricia whether she planned to collect keys from all her children. The room filled with laughter. Patricia smiled and took a sip of coffee. No, she said calmly. Everyone deserves their own space. I looked across the table at Michael. He looked back at me and smiled. Neither of us needed to say anything. We both understood what that statement represented. It was not just a change in behavior. It was a change in perspective. The following spring marked 3 years since Michael and I purchased the house. One Saturday morning we sat together on the back patio enjoying coffee while sunlight filtered through the trees. The yard looked different than it had when we moved in. The flower beds were fuller. The deck had been repaired. The landscaping had matured. Looking around, I realized the house had grown just as our marriage had. Not through dramatic moments. Through steady effort over time. Michael seemed to be thinking something similar. "Do you remember how all of this started?" he asked. I laughed softly. "With one question." He nodded. "It is funny." "What is?" He looked around the yard. At the time, I thought the discussion was about a key. I smiled. So did I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael added, "Now I realize it was never about the key." He was right. The key had simply exposed a much larger issue. It revealed assumptions that needed to be challenged, habits that needed to evolve, boundaries that needed to be defined. Most importantly, it forced all of us to have conversations we should have had years earlier. Later that afternoon, Patricia stopped by for a planned visit. She called ahead first, something that had become completely normal. When she arrived, she brought homemade cookies and spent most of the afternoon talking about a community project she had recently joined. Her life felt fuller now, more independent, less centered around our household. As she prepared to leave, she paused near the front door and looked back at us. "I am proud of you too," she said. Michael smiled. "For what?" Patricia looked around the house one final time. "For building a good life together." After she left, I stood by the window watching her car disappear down the street. Then I turned and looked at the home Michael and I had created. The rooms felt exactly as they should. Warm. Comfortable. Ours. Looking back now, I am grateful that I trusted the uneasy feeling I experienced that night at dinner. Not because it led to conflict, because it led to clarity. Sometimes the strongest relationships are not built by avoiding difficult conversations. They are built by having them with honesty, respect, and courage. In the end, nobody lost. Nobody was pushed away. We simply learned where healthy boundaries belong. And once we understood that, the house became more than a place to live. It became a home where every relationship finally had room to grow.